So building on this history and kind of moving from approximately 150 years ago, where the first concepts that the brain and behavior and psychology were linked, to medical examinations of physical damage to the structures of the brain and the neurological systems being strongly associated with clear impairment in both cognition, behavior, and function, but also personality. We then moved through kind of the more modern history of coming up with various tests that allow psychologists to be able to look for these impairments through performances on tests. So when is a neuropsychological evaluation indicated? In most cases, it's going to be when a patient is referred to a psychologist for an impairment or a psychological issue. And in that case, the psychologist may be trying to make the determination, is the cause of this behavioral change or impairment primarily psychological? So is it a personality or cognition issue? Or does the psychologist believe there is a physiological component? And a neuropsychological evaluation will usually be indicated as a set of tests to determine, is this more of a psychological issue, a physiological issue, or a combination of the two. So a pattern of tests will be conducted, most likely including an intelligence test, a personality test, and a perceptual motor memory test. So a lot of times when we're looking at neuropsychological evaluations, they're adding on top of previous tests that we've already discussed. So generally speaking, we're wanting to determine what is the cognitive function of the person, and that's usually going to be an intelligence test. We want to determine, is their personality kind of within the norms of the cultural expected personalities of someone that has grown up fairly well adjusted for functioning in the culture that they're within. And then finally, kind of this perceptual motor and memory test, so examining the physical structures of their performance. So when we're looking at neuropsychological evaluation, we often kind of separate out these types of assessments into two broad categories: hard signs versus soft signs. So a hard sign is that when we have a strong indicator that there is a neurological deficit, cranial nerve damage, neuroimaging. So we have basically, if someone comes in and they have clearly suffered trauma, think of, again, the case of Phineas Phage. There is a large metal rod shoved through the person's brain. That would be a hard sign that probably we need to test this person for neuropsychological impairment. However, there may be also the person suffered head injury, the person is known to have a genetic disorder that affects physical structures of the brain, or it can also just be various neuroimaging, MRIs, functional MRIs, there's CAT scans, PET scans, EMGs, EEGs. All of these are various techniques that allow us to image the actual physical structure and also to some extent the actual function of a person's neurological system, specifically the brain. We also can talk about soft signs, an indicator that is merely suggestive of a neurological deficit, an apparent inability to accurately copy a stimulus figure, for instance. So this would be an example of if someone comes in with some impairment or some issues, and a psychologist starts to use some of these perceptual motor and memory tests and finds you seem to be functioning at a normal level in most areas, but you have a specific deficit that normally is associated with a neurological issue. So this again allows us to examine that as a possibility. So another way we compartmentalize these types of tests is whether they're giving us, first, like we talked about in the last slide, either hard or soft data that there has been damage. But also we can talk about it versus a fixed versus flexible test. So neuropsychological examinations and assessments usually are either fixed or flexible. A fixed battery is a set of neurological tests that has been determined by a test publisher that basically takes a person through a battery of multiple tests. So I have three examples up here: the Luria, Nebraska, the Halstead-Retlin, and the Mini Mental State Exam. All of these basically will run through a series of tests, and they're most similar to individually administered. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know why my computer keeps popping up a weird vocal there, but I apologize for that. Anyway, so the fixed battery is a situation where the person is taking a battery of tests that's very similar to kind of an individualized intelligence test. Remember, an individualized intelligence test is when there is a licensed person that has been trained in giving that test. And the advantage of that individual test is it's a one-on-one test, one test giver, one test taker, and often it does involve oftentimes multiple choice questions, but it can also involve various other tests of intelligence or cognitive ability. Same thing with these fixed batteries. They're usually a series of both memory tests. They may be self-report tests, may include personality tests, but they'll also include visual perception tests, hearing perception tests, hand-eye coordination tests. So I have a couple of just quick examples. You see a child here that's actually doing what's called a Hanoi Tower. It's basically a puzzle, and someone's ability to actually successfully do this puzzle through a series of moves, moving various pieces along these three columns, is an indicator of cognitive impairment. It requires visual spatial perception skills. Another example is also just a visual test, so looking for visual difficulty in recognizing different colors. So this is basically a colorblind test. So if you can see the color green, you should see the number 74. If you have a deficit in being able to determine to basically differentiate green from other colors, you'll probably not see that number. A flexible approach permits the clinician to choose the most appropriate test case by case. So when you have a fixed battery, they're not designed to be given out piecemeal. You're not supposed to be using any one part of it at a time. You're supposed to be using the entirety of the test to basically create a profile to predict soft signs of possible neurological impairment. A flexible approach is a series of tests that are not necessarily designed to be given all together at one time. They're designed to be picked and chosen. They're very useful with what we call an a priori diagnosis, and a priori simply means before the fact. It means we already have an idea of what's wrong. So the person has come in and said, I have a lot of problem remembering numbers. So at that point, it may be a waste of time to have them go through an entire neurological assessment when you can simply choose a specific test that actually is made to look to see, is there impairment, physiological impairment, in the person's ability to process numerical memory. So we often will use these with schizophrenia. So again, if a psychologist expects that schizophrenia is the problem, there is specific tests which actually determine impairments of the physical brain that are common with schizophrenia and how they then result in actual behavior on these tests. Localized brain damage. So again, if you know someone has reported being hit in the head near one of either Broca's or Wernicke's area and is also reporting problems with language, again, there really wouldn't be necessarily a need to give them a fixed battery, possibly hours long, measuring all possible areas. You may want to just take a specific test that's looking at language acquisition or language understanding. So the types of these tests, and these types of tests can both be incorporated into a fixed battery or be presented as individual tests that a psychologist or an assessor can pick and choose a priori. Include a finger tapping test. This is kind of fine motor skill. Digit symbol tests, grip strength tests, so ability to actually control muscles. Tactile form recognition, so basically just using your hands to recognize objects. Tactile performance, basically how successful you are at sensory perception, and these can even be identifying basically pricks on your hand at various areas. Drawing tasks, so being able to represent clocks, bicycles, people, reproduce crosses in the proper direction, and again, various physiological impairments will have a fairly drastic impact on these various tasks. So someone that has, for example, damaged the area of the brain that mainly controls our ability to understand visual perception and mental rotation will have a very hard time reproducing, for example, a cross that has different lengths of the various arms of the cross in the exact same way because they really can't process that information. The ability to understand overlapping figures, object assembly, creating various things out of Tinker Toys or various other building blocks, designing things with blocks, being able to navigate mazes, being able to pick out individual items in a large visual field. That's the field search test. Wisconsin card sorting, so again, being able to sort information. Trail making, being able to actually understand kind of directions and understanding and navigating directional tasks. Various other tests, including, for example, the Stroop test, digit letter memory test, picture absurdity tests. All of these can be also adjusted for various age levels. And all of them, again, look at if you have what is considered kind of normal neurological function, there is a kind of minimum and maximum that you'd be expected to perform on all of these tests. And if you actually do very, very well on these tests, it's actually an indicator that there's possibly actually a positive physical difference in your brain structure. And if you tend to perform poorly, it probably means there's a deficit in that physiology of the neurological systems. A lot of neuropsychological evaluation is also focused on actual memory and the actual tests of memory. And we know that memory has been broken up into probably, well, just generally 4 broad terms. So procedural memory, memory for skills, i.e. riding a bicycle. And often this is interesting because procedural memory often survives through fairly traumatic damage to the memory systems of the brain. So a lot of our case studies of people that have received severe damage to the brain, resulting in severe impairment of their ability to form memories or access memories, often still have procedural memories. So they can't tell you, for instance, where they learned piano. They might not even be able to tell you that they know how to play the piano. But if you put them in front of a piano and prior to the damage they knew how to play, they can still play the piano. What's also interesting about this is once the damage has occurred, that someone does get better on various tests that they're taking as they develop procedural memory, even if they can't remember taking the test. So, for example, if you take someone that's never done a maze test before, who has been able to form no long-term memories whatsoever, they've had severe damage to their ability to form new memories. If you then give them that maze day after day, they'll never remember having ever seen that maze before or ever having completed the maze before. But slowly over time, they'll actually get better at the maze. They'll get quicker and quicker at completing it, and that's basically forming procedural memories. So we know through this that actually this process of creating and accessing procedural memories is different than other types of memories. Declarative memory is memory for factual material, and it's often divided up then into semantic versus episodic. So semantic is memory for facts, and episodic is memory for facts in a particular context. So basically, knowing that the space shuttle, Columbia and Challenger both exploded, is a fact. Being able to remember where you were when you learned those facts or where you were when you actually saw these events happen, that's episodic. So semantic is knowing it happened. Episodic is knowing where you got that information from. And again, various damage in various parts of the brain result in different impairment. There is various areas of the brain that are strongly associated with a difficulty in people being able to declare memory, so being able to recall it, declarative memory. Being able to access facts memory, so semantic memory, and most of what we're used to, especially in modern media, is more of damage to the episodic memory, so our ability to actually create new memories of situations or to recall previous. And when we talk about amnesia, we're mainly focused on episodic memory. A widely used test of memory is the California Verbal Learning Test 2, which actually is made to look at each one of these in turn. Other tests include the Wechsler Memory Scale and the Seguin-Goddard Form Board. So again, there's a lot of different measures. Some of them are fixed, some of them are flexible, and again, made so there's individual tests to look for just episodic memory deficits, just semantic memory deficits, and there's also fixed tests that are made to look for the entire wide range of possible deficits in memory formation. So things that these tests may miss include personality change. So if you're simply using neuropsychological assessments, not pairing them with, for example, intelligence or cognitive ability tests and personality tests, some of the things that can be missed is that someone may actually still have a physiological impairment in the neuropsychological systems. It's just not necessarily affecting memory or sensation. It's affecting, for example, personality. And again, Phineas Gage, we knew there was physiological damage. There was a giant rod shoved through the person's head. But a lot of the changes would not necessarily have been picked up on any of the modern neurological tests that we've been talking about because they were mainly changes in temperament, changes in behavior, and changes in personality. So a lot of times if we're looking for neurological, we are also wanting to ask, is there evidence of personality or psychological change that seems abrupt for any psychological disorder or psychological malady or psychopathology. So this also can include swearing or inappropriate use of language, lack of extreme emotional reaction, depression. All of these may also be indicators of a potential change in either the chemistry or the physical structure of the brain. We also have to worry about possible faking. So faking on these tests to basically try to indicate that people have an impairment when they don't. There has been some examples of some fairly famous case studies, not with memory, but specifically with, for example, extreme schizophrenia, of these tests indicating someone had severe physiological deficits when actually they were kind of faking the test to get attention and to basically, to get attention. We also have to take into account the patient's history, so medical, social, psychological, and educational. So, for example, a neuropsychological test might indicate that there is severe physical impairment in the person's ability to process. But if we also know that person has a medical history of poor health, poor nutrition, has a social history of abuse, has a psychological history of kind of maladaptive behaviors, and has been poorly educated, that might actually indicate that no, this isn't a physiological difference. This is a result of basically environment and cognition.